In early 2026, the United Kingdom faces an unexpected trade threat from its closest partner, the United States. What began as a diplomatic dispute over Greenland has quickly spilled into potential tariff escalation, unsettling markets and policymakers alike. Britons are now watching export projections and financial indicators closely, wondering how trade barriers could affect jobs, growth, and political relationships. Today, Ujustuet's video explores why the UK, long an advocate of free trade, is suddenly wary of tariffs and how this shock could reshape Britain and its economic trajectory. The UK's nervousness over tariffs is not a theoretical debate. It's rooted in real, immediate threats that could reshape the nation's economic outlook and export performance. In January 2026, US President Donald Trump renewed threats to impose tariffs on the UK and 7 other European allies unless they back down in a dispute over Greenland, OS governance, prompting rapid reactions in policy circles and financial markets. London's FTSE 100 index fell sharply on news of the tariff threat, marking its worst drop in weeks as investors weighed the potential impact on export revenues and multinational supply chains. Economists warn that even a modest tariff of 10% could hit British exporters hard, especially industries like automotive, luxury goods, and machinery that depend heavily on transatlantic trade, a sector already experiencing sluggish growth and low confidence. Some forecasts suggest that punitive levies could squeeze Britain's GDP significantly and edge the economy closer to contraction, at a time when growth expectations are already subdued. Political leaders in the UK reacted strongly. Prime Minister Keir Starmer publicly condemned the tariff threat as completely wrong, urging diplomacy rather than escalation while preparing support packages for vulnerable domestic firms. Business Secretary Peter Kyle also rejected quick fixes like rejoining a customs union with the EU, emphasizing the complexity and long timelines such a shift would involve in contrast to immediate trade tensions. Part of the nervousness stems from Britain's historic reliance on open markets and export-led growth strategies post-Brexit. Tariffs not only raise costs for producers, but introduce uncertainty in long-term planning, stifle investment, and push global partners to redirect supply chains to more stable environments. With global inflation and weak growth already pressuring the UK economy, a tariff shock, even if it remains a threat, alters expectations for firms and households alike. Market volatility, job risk in manufacturing hubs, and political strain are all byproducts of this unfolding trade confrontation. If tariffs against the UK move from threat to reality, which British industries would be hit hardest, and who would win from higher costs at the border? The reason Britain is so anxious is that its economic relationship with the United States is deeper, more complex, and more vulnerable than many people assume. The US is the UK's single largest trading partner outside the European Union, accounting for roughly 1/5 of all British exports in goods and services combined, with particularly heavy exposure in high-value sectors such as pharmaceuticals, aerospace components, machinery, luxury goods, financial services, and creative industries. Unlike goods trade, a large share of this relationship runs through services and investment rather than physical shipments, which means tariff threats create uncertainty not only about border taxes, but about broader regulatory retaliation, investment pullbacks, and corporate relocation decisions. Manufacturing regions, such as the Midlands, Northwest, and Northeast, are especially sensitive because many factories rely on US-linked supply chains where even modest tariffs can wipe out profit margins and discourage new orders. At the same time, London's financial sector depends heavily on transatlantic capital flows, dollar liquidity, and US corporate clients. Any escalation could reduce deal activity, weaken the pound, and tighten credit conditions at home. Another hidden vulnerability is Ireland, a significant portion of UKU. Trade is routed through Irish ports and logistics hubs, meaning US tariffs could indirectly disrupt British firms even when products do not ship directly from UK soil. Businesses also fear that retaliation could spill beyond tariffs into technology restrictions, defense procurement, and regulatory barriers, multiplying the economic cost far beyond simple export taxes. For a post-Brexit UK already struggling with weak productivity, low investment, and fragile growth, the prospect of a trade shock with Washington raises the risk of stalled recovery, lost competitiveness, and deeper dependence on volatile global markets. In short, the UK's exposure is not just about how much it sells to America, it is about how embedded the US is in Britain's entire economic ecosystem. If tariffs ripple far beyond exports into finance, investment, and Ireland's supply routes, could the real damage to Britain come from areas most people never see? Britain's anxiety over US tariffs runs deeper, because it exposes a structural weakness in the UK's post-Brexit trade strategy, which was built on the promise of striking new global deals outside the European Union. After leaving the EU, London pursued an open, outward-looking model, betting that Closer ties with the United States, Indo-Pacific partners, and emerging markets would offset reduced access to Europe. Yet the tariff threat from Washington reveals how fragile that bet can be when geopolitics overrides economics. Roughly 40% of UK goods exports still go to the EU, while the US is the single largest non-EU partner, meaning Britain cannot afford conflict with either side. If the US imposes tariffs, the UK has limited leverage. It lacks the market size of the EU and the industrial heft of China to retaliate effectively. Meanwhile, many of the UK's post-Brexit trade agreements, such as deals with Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, had only marginal economic gains, compared with potential losses from a US trade war. Businesses also worry that Washington's actions could trigger a broader protectionist wave, forcing the UK into a world of fragmented trade blocs where its mid-sized economy struggles to compete. This risk is amplified by Britain's dependence on imported components for cars, machinery, and electronics. Tariffs raise input costs, making UK products less competitive globally. Financial markets reflect this vulnerability. Sterling tends to weaken whenever trade tensions rise, increasing inflation through higher import prices and squeezing household incomes. Politically, the tariff dispute reignites debate over whether the UK should seek closer alignment with the EU AS trade rules to gain collective bargaining power, a move the government has resisted. In short, the US tariff threat does not just endanger exports. It challenges the entire logic of Britain's post-Brexit economic model and its ability to navigate a more divided world. If Britain's post-Brexit strategy falters under US pressure, will the UK pivot back toward Europe or double down on global trade? British politics has become central to why tariffs worry the UK so much, because any escalation with Washington intersects with domestic divisions, public trust, and the government's fragile economic credibility. The Labour government under Keir Starmer is trying to project stability after years of Brexit turbulence, inflation, and fiscal strain, yet a trade fight with the United States risks reopening arguments over Britain's place in the world. Pro-Brexit conservatives would likely frame tariffs as proof that the UK must stand firm against foreign pressure, while pro-EU voices would argue that only closer alignment with Brussels can protect British exporters. This split complicates diplomacy because ministers must negotiate toughly with Washington while avoiding a political backlash at home that could weaken their bargaining position. At the same time, businesses and trade unions are pressing the government for clarity, fearing that prolonged uncertainty will freeze investment, delay hiring, and slow wage growth. Regional politics also matter. Manufacturing areas in the Midlands and North, many of which supported Brexit, are among the most exposed to export shocks, raising the risk of renewed political discontent if jobs are threatened. Internationally, Britain wants to present itself as a reliable partner to both the US and the EU. But tariff threats force it to choose between solidarity with Europe and loyalty to Washington. Defense and security ties further complicate matters, as the UK depends on US cooperation through NATO and intelligence sharing, making retaliation awkward. Financial markets watch these political tensions closely, reacting to any sign of division with currency swings and higher borrowing costs. In this sense, tariffs are not just an economic problem for Britain. They are a test of whether the country can maintain a coherent strategy in a fragmented world. How the government manages this balance will shape confidence in the UK. If tariffs turn into a domestic political battle as much as a trade fight, could Britain lose twice, economically and politically? British businesses are already behaving as if US tariffs are not just a threat, but a real possibility, and their responses reveal how vulnerable the economy has become to sudden trade disruption. Many exporters, especially in automotive, aerospace, chemicals, and high-end manufacturing, have begun reviewing contracts, renegotiating delivery terms, and exploring alternative markets to reduce dependence on the United States. Some multinational firms with UK operations are quietly shifting parts of their supply chains toward the EU or Asia to avoid potential tariff exposure, even before any official measures are imposed. Smaller firms are in a weaker position. They lack the financial buffers, legal teams, and global networks needed to adapt quickly, making them more likely to cut investment, delay hiring, or scale back production. Industry groups such as the Confederation of British Industry, CBI, and Make UK have warned that prolonged uncertainty alone could depress capital spending and weaken productivity, regardless of whether tariffs actually materialize. Retailers and import-dependent sectors are also preparing for higher costs, as retaliatory measures could raise prices on American goods, from machinery to consumer products, feeding into inflation at home. Financial markets amplify this anxiety. Banks have tightened lending standards for export-heavy companies, and insurers are increasing premiums for trade-related risks. At the same time, logistics firms are modeling worst-case scenarios involving border delays, paperwork bottlenecks, and shipping reroutes through Ireland or continental Europe. These corporate reactions show that the economic damage of tariffs often begins long before any official policy takes effect. For a UK economy already struggling with weak investment and stagnant productivity, the mere possibility of a US trade conflict is reshaping business behavior in ways that could slow growth, reduce competitiveness, and deepen regional inequalities. In essence, tariffs are not just a future risk, they are already altering how British firms plan, invest, and compete today. If companies are already changing behavior before tariffs arrive, how much economic damage has already been done? The UK government is trying to balance firmness with pragmatism as it prepares for a possible tariff clash with Washington, but its policy toolkit is narrower than many assume. London cannot easily retaliate against the United States without risking escalation that would hurt British exporters even more so. Ministers are prioritizing diplomacy, targeted support for vulnerable industries, and quiet engagement with Congress and US business groups that oppose tariffs. At the same time, the Treasury is modeling scenarios that include emergency tax relief, subsidies, and credit guarantees for firms most exposed to American markets, high-end manufacturing. However, such measures are constrained by tight public finances and a political commitment to fiscal discipline after years of debt and inflation. The government is also accelerating talks with the European Union on closer trade cooperation, not as a formal customs union, but through regulatory alignment that could make British exports more resilient and reduce reliance on the US market. This strategy faces resistance from hardline Brexiteers who fear creeping reintegration with Brussels. Meanwhile, Whitehall is coordinating with allies in Europe and Canada to present a united front against what they see as unpredictable US trade policy, hoping that collective pressure can moderate Washington's stance. Yet coordination is difficult because each country has different exposure and priorities. Ultimately, the UKAS response reflects a dilemma: protect national interests without burning bridges with its most important security partner. The challenge is that every option carries economic, diplomatic, or political risk, leaving Britain with no perfect move. If diplomacy fails and tariffs become reality, will the UK's cautious strategy protect its economy or leave it exposed? A prolonged tariff conflict with the United States would not just create a short-term shock for the UK, it could gradually reshape the structure of the entire British economy. Higher trade barriers would likely weaken sterling further, making imports more expensive and pushing inflation back up at a time when households are still recovering from a cost-of-living crisis. The Bank of England would then face a difficult choice between keeping interest rates high to control prices or cutting them to protect growth, repeating the same policy dilemma that has plagued central banks globally. Manufacturing could suffer permanent damage as firms relocate production closer to the US market or deeper inside the European Union, reducing Britain's industrial base and worsening regional inequality in the Midlands and North. Services, especially finance, could also feel the strain if American banks and investors scale back their presence in London due to regulatory or political uncertainty. Ireland adds another layer of complexity. If US tariffs disrupt UK-EU supply routes through Dublin and Belfast, Northern Ireland's fragile trade arrangements could become a flashpoint again, reopening political tensions around the post-Brexit settlement. Over time, these pressures might force Britain to rethink its global trade strategy, potentially moving closer to EU alignment despite political resistance at home. The Institute for Fiscal Studies warns that slower growth from trade conflict would tighten public finances, limiting the government's ability to invest in infrastructure, health, and education. In short, tariffs could leave a lasting imprint on productivity, investment, and Britain's role in the global economy long after the headlines fade. If tariffs permanently weaken investment and productivity, could this become Britain's most damaging economic shock since Brexit? If tariffs between the UK and the United States harden into a prolonged trade conflict, the distribution of winners and losers would be uneven, reshaping power across industries, regions, and even rival economies. British exporters in autos, aerospace, luxury goods, and chemicals would likely be among the biggest losers as their products become more expensive in the US market, pushing buyers toward European, Japanese, or South Korean alternatives. Small and medium-sized firms would suffer more than multinationals because they lack the scale to reroute supply chains or absorb higher costs, deepening inequality within the UK business landscape. Manufacturing regions in the Midlands, Northwest, and Northeast would feel the sharpest employment pressure, while London's finance sector could lose deals to New York, Frankfurt, or Paris if transatlantic capital flows cool. On the other hand, some UK industries might benefit indirectly. Domestic producers could gain protection from cheaper American imports, and companies aligned more closely with the EU might strengthen their position inside European value chains. Across the Atlantic, US consumers and firms would also face higher prices and disrupted inputs, meaning America would not win cleanly either. Meanwhile, third countries such as Germany, Ireland, Canada, Mexico, India, and Vietnam could emerge as unintended beneficiaries by capturing displaced trade and investment. Global supply chains would gradually pivot away from both the UK and the US, accelerating the fragmentation of world trade into regional blocs. In this sense, tariffs would create fewer clear winners than many assume, replacing efficient networks with political trade patterns that reduce overall growth and raise costs for almost everyone. If most players lose while only a few outsiders gain, is this really a trade policy or a self-inflicted economic wound? As the tariff threat lingers, the UK is being forced to rethink what its long-term trade strategy actually is, beyond short-term crisis management. Officials inside Whitehall increasingly acknowledge that relying on ad hoc diplomacy with Washington is not a durable plan for a mid-sized economy in a fragmented world. One option, gaining quiet traction, is deeper regulatory alignment with the European Union. Not a full return to the single market, but closer cooperation on standards, customs processes, and supply chain rules that could make British exports more resilient to external shocks. At the same time, the government is exploring new trade partnerships in the Indo-Pacific and the Gulf to diversify markets. Yet most of these agreements are unlikely to replace the economic weight of the US or EU in the near term. Business groups are urging ministers to provide clarity, arguing that uncertainty is now more damaging than any single tariff. The Cabinet Office has reportedly begun scenario planning for a world where trade blocs harden, forcing the UK to choose between deeper ties with Europe or a more political alliance with the United States. Meanwhile, think tanks like the Center for European Reform warn that Britain's bargaining power remains limited unless it coordinates more closely with Brussels and other European economies. Financial markets are watching closely. Any signal of a coherent strategy could stabilize sterling, while continued ambiguity would likely keep volatility high. In this sense, the tariff dispute is becoming a catalyst for a much bigger debate about Britain's place in the global economy. The choices made in the next few years will shape trade, investment, and growth for a generation. If Britain must ultimately choose between Europe and the United States, which path would truly serve its economic future? Britain now stands at a genuine crossroads where a single tariff dispute could redefine its economic identity for decades. If tensions with Washington escalate, the UK may discover that its much-promised global Britain war strategy requires far more diplomatic and economic muscle than it currently possesses. A prolonged trade conflict would likely push London closer to Europe by necessity rather than choice, as alignment with the EU offers scale, stability, and collective bargaining power that Britain cannot achieve alone. Yet, such a shift would reignite domestic political battles over Brexit, testing public patience and party unity at a moment when trust in institutions remains fragile. Alternatively, doubling down on the US alliance could deepen dependence on American markets and politics, leaving Britain vulnerable to future policy swings in Washington. Either path carries risks, but indecision may be the costliest option of all, because uncertainty deters investment, weakens sterling, and erodes Britain's global credibility. Over time, tariffs could accelerate a broader transformation, in which the UK becomes less of a manufacturing nation and more reliant on services, finance, and niche high-tech sectors, widening regional inequalities between London and the rest of the country. The real question is not whether tariffs will damage the economy in the short run, they likely will, but whether Britain can use this shock to rebuild a coherent, realistic trade strategy that balances sovereignty, prosperity, and alliance politics. The next few years will reveal whether the UK adapts with clarity and confidence, or drifts deeper into economic vulnerability in an increasingly divided world. If Britain is forced to choose its path, will it move toward Europe for security or cling to Washington for influence? And which choice truly protects its economy? If you want to understand how trade, geopolitics, and economics shape real countries in real time, stay with Wealth Woven and keep looking beyond the headlines.